Hello and welcome everyone to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Sheppard, your host, and thank you for tuning in today. Today we have a great show ahead where we will be covering everything from tonight's Western Conference Finals Game 4 between the Timberwolves and the Dallas Mavericks, to ESPN's defense rankings for the upcoming fantasy football season. And be sure to stick around before you go to talk about the potential NBA Finals betting odds and what a Celtics-Mavs final would look like should the Mavericks win tonight. But before we begin, as always, I do ask that you like, follow, and subscribe to the show. Also, we do get a lot of tips and donations, so please, if you will, leave them all at the link gsmc.cloud. It is a huge support to the network, a huge support to both me and my fellow podcasters, so do please consider going to that link and giving us some love. As for today's show, we start off, like I said, with the Western Conference Finals Game 4 between the Timberwolves and the Mavericks. As we saw last night, the Celtics got the job done, swept the Indiana Pacers. They will be your Eastern Conference Finals champions and representatives for the Eastern Conference in the NBA Finals. Can the Mavs do the same tonight? Looking ahead at the betting odds for tonight's game, Dallas is favored minus 2.5. Also, the over-under is 210.5. And the money line is Minnesota plus 110. So as you can see, Dallas looking to close this one out, but reflecting the close games that have been going on in this series. Last game, of course, was the only time that Dallas kind of had a runaway game there at the end. But looking ahead to the fantasy projections for tonight, obviously the big name himself, Luka Doncic, along with Kyrie Irving, they are accounting for 77% of the offensive production for the Dallas Mavericks. So of course we have to talk about him. Tonight he's valued at $13K on DraftKings and is projected to have a whopping 61.5 DraftKings fantasy points for tonight's game. So yeah, that just reflects how amazing a series both him and Kyrie are having. But looking at the Minnesota Timberwolves side of things, we see their superstar kind of getting a lower projection tonight, and that is Anthony Edwards, and is projected to only go for 11.6K, a little bit lower than Luka. And he is only projected to have 47.8 DraftKings fantasy points, and while still good, it is reflecting what many people have seen in this series, is that in the latter stages of the game, Anthony Edwards does get tired, he does get labored, and that is starting to become reflective of the fantasy projections that he gets in daily fantasy. And I think that in order for Anthony Edwards to have a good game, he needs to be compounded by some other role players. And why not point out one of the better role players for Minnesota in this series, Jaden McDaniels. Very efficient player on both sides of the floor. He did not get selected to the all-defensive team last year for nothing. He was very efficient in the Phoenix Game 3. He had 15 points on 6 for 8 shooting, including 3 for 4 from the three-point line. And in Game 1 as well, he was also very good shooting. One of the top scorers for Minnesota in that game with 24 points, 4 rebounds, 3 assists, and 1 steal in 39 minutes. If you're talking about someone who is not a superstar, but you want to roster on your team, he is a fantastic option. Even as a starter for tonight's game, I think that he is just a stellar player, and he gets overlooked in terms of role players on the Minnesota Timberwolves. Obviously, Naz Reid has such a huge impact on the defensive end as well, but he is not the same point scorer as Jaden McDaniels. He can shoot from anywhere, and he is willing to carry the load should Anthony Edwards tire towards the end of the game. Now, in terms of the Dallas Mavericks side, there really isn't much to talk about outside of Luka and Kyrie, just on the offensive side of things. But if there is one player who I think can make that contribution, can step forward as a role player, it is Daniel Gafford. Just an incredible asset to this Dallas Mavericks team. It adds that paint presence down low, as we've always mentioned with him. I think that he will have a fantastic game for tonight, helping Dallas try and clinch. I think that Daniel Gafford, is one of the better players to look out for on this team because of the fact that not only is he helping them defensively in the paint, but also can contribute offensively as well. In game 2, for example, he scored 60 points on 80% from the field. I think that Daniel Gafford is overlooked a lot in terms of his offensive prowess, but he also is very good defensively. So if you want a well-rounded player to fill out your roster, either on the bench or as a utility option, Daniel Gafford, for me, is the guy. Obviously, when you're looking at a team like Dallas, you don't necessarily have that much offensive production outside of Luka and Kyrie, so there really isn't going to be a guy who's going to score a lot of fantasy points. But tonight, Daniel Gafford is a pretty cheap option too at 6.6 valuation, and he's projected to have 25.7 fantasy points tonight, so a solid option. Also looking at McDaniels, also a very cheap option at 6K tonight. He's only projected to have 23.8 fantasy points, still valuable assets. Now, in terms of the game and how it's going to flow, I do think that Dallas has the advantage right now. Obviously, they're up 3-0, so why wouldn't they? But they're also at home. They're going to want to clinch it for their fans. Luka and Kyrie are proven to be very unstoppable. Anthony Edwards cannot keep up with their attack. 77% offensive production in the series for both of them. So I just think that Dallas is the better team in the Western Conference, and they have proven that not only through Luka and Kyrie being the best two superstars in this postseason, but also by the fact that their role players are beginning to get that experience. Derek Lively in his first postseason, contributing along with Daniel Gafford down low. Just fantastically built team. They're not necessarily, that built around Luka and Kyrie, even though the stats reflect it. But overall, I think that Dallas is going to close this series out, and we are going to have an inevitable Celtics-Mavs final. Stick around to the end of the series when I talk about the implications for that. But looking at tonight's game, I think that everything's going to cover for Dallas. I think they are easily going to cover that point spread, giving 2.5 to Minnesota tonight. So I just think that also they're going to hit the over. I think that all these games in this series have kind of been hitting the under just mainly due to how close they are. I just think that tonight Dallas is going to blow Minnesota out of the water. They're going to want to win this game going away. It's going to reflect in the score. Kyrie and Luka are going to match each other perfectly tonight on both sides of the floor. I think that Daniel Gafford is going to help out immensely defensively. I think that Derek Lively is always a spark plug for this team. I just think that Dallas is going to score as many points as possible early and often, and that is why the over will hit. I'm not attracted to the money line for Minnesota right now. I just think that they are looking tired, and it's reflected in how they play late in games. It's not just Anthony Edwards, it's Rudy Gobert and Karl Anthony Towns. They need to be better in terms of decision making to even have a chance in these games. In the past couple of games have not shown that the Minnesota Timberwolves are willing to focus on the latter stages of the game, and that is why Dallas is taking advantage of that and winning these close contests. A lot of people are thinking that, hey, Minnesota's defense will keep them in this series, and it has for the most part in these games, but ultimately, you can't not focus in the last 2 minutes of the game and lose your head, and that is what has been happening for the Dallas Mavericks. So I am looking for players like Jaden McDaniels and Naz Reid to help elevate this team. Obviously, a lot of pressure is on Anthony Edwards tonight, and he just needs to deliver. He feels that pressure, and ultimately I think it's getting to him due to the pace that Dallas has played with in these series. And I think that Daniel Gafford and Derek Lively are also beginning to limit both Gobert and Karl Anthony Towns down low. So we need, if you're a Minnesota Timberwolves fan, you need Jaden McDaniels and Naz Reid to just step up and look to implement their game within the scheme that Minnesota runs. I think that ultimately defense is the name of the game for Minnesota, and offense is the name of the game for the Dallas Mavericks tonight. Just overviewing my predictions for tonight, Dallas will cover the spread. I think that last game proved that they can pull away late in games, especially if Minnesota's heads are not in it. And the over is going to hit tonight, mainly due to the amount of points that Dallas will score rather than Minnesota. So ultimately, those are my predictions for tonight, and that will just about do it for the first segment of this show. Coming up next, we are going to be looking at an NHL game, Game 4 of the Eastern Conference Finals between the Panthers and the Rangers, coming up next.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I hope you enjoyed the first segment of the show. Before we get into the second segment, as always, do consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud to support both the network, myself, and my fellow podcasters. It is greatly appreciated. Moving on to the second segment of the show, we switch from the NBA to the NHL, where the Florida Panthers take on the New York Rangers in an exhilarating Game 4. After an exhilarating Game 3 where the Rangers kind of stole the game away from Florida after they were outshot, they took it in overtime off an Alex Wenberg goal. Ironically enough, his first goal ever as a New York Ranger, coming in a big-time game in the Eastern Conference Finals. Tonight's Game 4 should be a very good matchup. Let's look at the betting odds for tonight's game. The money line sits at New York at plus 145 and Florida at minus 170. The total for points is 5.5. So obviously a very even game to match what happened in Game 3. But considering fantasy perspective, this is really anyone's game here because there have been so many different contributors for both Florida and New York in this series. So I can't really say who's going to step up for either side tonight. But if you want to bank on someone on Florida continuing his production, how about Sam Reinhart last game? One of the main reasons why Florida was even in that game despite outshooting the Rangers. He had 2 power play goals in that game. Sam Reinhart tonight is valued at 6.8K, and he's projected to have 13.3 fantasy points tonight. And in my opinion, that is a bargain. He is solid in the power play, solid in the faceoff, just an overall well-rounded athlete. Helps out Florida defensively, and just a huge impact player whenever the power play unit for Florida is on the ice, or even at even strength. Such a solid player. A lot of blocked shots as well in the playoff. That is key in terms of building your fantasy roster if you're in a league that includes hits as a part of the scoring. But overall, Sam Reinhart is my headline player for the Florida Panthers tonight. In terms of looking at the New York Rangers, this is a team that is won by hook or by crook from support from all different lines. And I just want to highlight one player who I think has been kind of like the bell cow for the New York Rangers in these past couple of games. How about Barclay Goodrow? Not a popular player, not a sexy player for the New York Rangers, but I think that these past 2 games have shown how good he can be, how scrappy he is as a player, and I think that Barclay Goodrow is a player that a lot of people are underrating in terms of fantasy just because he's not, a scorer. He's not necessarily a nice name to have on your team, but overall, Barclay Goodrow in these past couple of games has proven himself an overtime winner in the last game 2 games ago, and a goal in Game 3 I think that ultimately he's finding his confidence. He's solid in the face-off. He's solid in that line, that lower level line for the New York Rangers. And I think that Barclay Goodrow is a name to remember as a cheap option, only valued at $3K tonight. Only projected to have 5.2 fantasy points too. So if you're looking for a bargain and a steal at a low-key position, I think that Barclay Goodrow is your choice for tonight's game. Now looking at another important player for the New York Rangers, how about Igor Shesterkin? We always talk about goalies on this show. They are very important in terms of fantasy. If they get you a win, that's very vital. Igor Shesterkin got the Rangers a win in Game 3, in my opinion, a huge catalyst as to why they were able to take that game to overtime and ultimately win it. Obviously, letting up 4 goals as a goalie's got to hurt a little bit. He probably didn't want to give up as many goals as he did, but considering the fact that he faced so many high-danger scoring chances and the Rangers were outshot 37-23, saving 33 shots is not bad, and he made some big saves down the stretch to even get that game to overtime when they were overwhelmed in the third period of that game. So Igor Shesterkin, I think, is just going to need to step up his game a little bit. Obviously, he still is letting in goals, but I think what is most important to the Rangers' success is his clutch goaltending. Can he, late in the game, make some key saves to help propel the Rangers offensively as well? The Rangers all start with Igor Shesterkin. Igor Shesterkin is the heartbeat between the creases for the New York Rangers. Tonight, he's projected to have 14.3 fantasy points, and he goes for 8.3K. He's a highly coveted asset in terms of fantasy tonight. Another player on the Florida Panthers outside of Sam Reinhart is Brandon Montour, a very low-key guy. I don't think he's going to score as many points as some of the other forwards or defensemen on the Florida Panthers, like a Chuck or someone like that, or a Barkov, or even a Forsling. But I think Brandon Montour, in terms of such a scrappy young defenseman, I think that he is a huge asset if you're in a hits league that values hits. I think that Brandon Montour is one to look out for. Another cheap option. A little bit pricier than, say, a Barclay Goodrow, but I still think he's going to be a huge asset for the Florida Panthers tonight. In terms of how I think this game is going to go, I do not expect it to be as high scoring as Game 3. I think this is going to be a much lower scoring game, and it's going to be reflected in the fact that I think this game is going to go under the points value tonight. I think this is going to look like a 2-1, maybe 3-1 game for, I believe, the Florida Panthers to win this game. Coming into this series, Florida's hugest asset was probably the fact that they had the better line depth than the Rangers. They had the better goal scoring chances than the Rangers. They were going to pepper Igor Shesterkin, and it is translated, even though it hasn't translated in terms of wins, in terms of goals scored. I think that the Florida Panthers are a team that just will operate their game at any given time, and it's reflected in the stats. I think that ultimately tonight, I think that Florida will finally break through. I think that Sam Reinhart will have a huge game for Florida tonight. I think that in terms of goalies, I think that Sergei Bobrovsky, a player who we've talked about often on this podcast, is going to have another huge game. Kind of wants to bounce back from letting up 5 goals, including an overtime goal that was kind of scrappy and was scored for the first time by Alex Wennberg as a New York Ranger. So I kind of feel like he wants them to bounce back. I think that overall, the look for the Panthers to dominate in terms of power play, dominate in terms of penalty kill, and get even with the New York Rangers tonight. I think this is going to be a 3-1 final in favor of the Florida Panthers. So the New York Rangers will not cover. I think Florida will win outright. I think the Florida money line is looking kind of pretty right now. I think that at -170, it's a great value for you. But overall, this game is going to be a very tight game. I don't think this series is going to see that high level of goals as we've seen in prior games. I just think that something has to give for one of these teams. And for Florida, I think it's their time to prove to the New York Rangers that they are no slouch. I think that the Florida Panthers are kind of the beasts of the Eastern Conference, in my opinion, looking over the past couple of years. Yes, the Rangers have also made it to a conference finals before, but the Florida Panthers are looking to break through for the Stanley Cup. And the Rangers are, yes, they're the President's Trophy winners. Yes, they are pretty good in terms of playoffs at least, but their metrics show that they are kind of a paper tiger a little bit. I think that ultimately, coming in from the regular season, a lot of worries were on the Rangers. Yes, they've combated them in the playoffs by elevating their whatever makes them good, like their penalty kill, their power play. But ultimately, the Florida Panthers have more experience. I think they also utilize their players better. I think that their ability to rotate from a guy like Matthew Tkachuk to a guy like Alexander Barkov to a guy like Gustav Forsling to a guy like Sam Reinhart on the offensive side proves to me that the Florida Panthers are not going to fall down easily. I think that the New York Rangers have to be wary of that, and they have to also use their rotation to their advantage. Rotation is a very important aspect of this series, in my opinion. How will Laviolette view younger players in this series? Will Rempe get some good minutes? Will a player like Will Cooley get some minutes as well? I just think that ultimately the Panthers are older, they're more experienced, and they are looking to win the Stanley Cup final for me. So, in terms of betting, bet the Florida Panthers tonight to tie up this series. But that is just about going to do it for the second segment of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Coming up next, we are going into our final ESPN rankings in terms of PPR leagues. Yes, we are going to be looking at the defenses. They are probably one of the more important aspects of fantasy football, so don't want to miss out on that segment. We will be right back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new...
Hello and welcome back, everyone, to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I hope you stuck around because this next segment is a very exciting segment. We are in the home stretch of ESPN's rankings for the upcoming fantasy football season, at least for PPR leagues. We will get to IDP leagues later in the week, but right now we are looking at the final rankings. Yes, the ESPN defensive fantasy rankings. This should be a very exciting ranking, mainly because of how many good defenses there are in the league. It seems like this is becoming a very defensive league, and it's highly reflected in the stats. So let's get right into it. The number one defense. There should be no surprise here. It is the Cleveland Browns. Jim Schwartz's men proving that they're the number one defense in the league. They have so many talented players at each level of the defense. Let's look at their stats from last season, shall we? They were the number one defense in terms of opposing yards per game at 274.9. That's crazy that they were able to hold their opponents under 300 yards per game throughout an entire NFL season, especially considering the fact that their offense was not as good as some other defenses' offenses. And then They were also number 1 in terms of opposing 3rd and 4th down conversion percentage at near 30% and 40% respectively. That just goes to show how dominant Jim Schwartz's men were. One of the most exciting defenses in the league. Of course, you've heard of a guy named Myles Garrett, obviously coming off of last season where he had, in my opinion, I think he had 14 sacks last season. Just an incredible player. Another underrated player from this defense. How about Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, one of the best off-ball linebackers in my opinion. He's moved so well laterally for this defense. And then looking at a highly young, in my opinion, corner group and kind of DB group between Martin Emerson Jr. and Greg Newsome II. They are incredibly rangy players, a lot of incredible traits, and Jim Schwartz has coached them so well. Overall, I expect this defense to be the number 1 defense at the end of the season as well, especially if Deshaun Watson elevates his play offensively. Obviously, the Browns defense last year might have had to play from behind a lot more than they were used to, so look to see if that is reflected in terms of how Deshaun Watson plays as well. Moving on to number 2, no surprise here either, the San Francisco 49ers, another team that has incredible depth at every position, led by that man, Nick Bosa, probably my number 2 defensive player right now. Last season, Nick Bosa had 10.5 sacks, kind of a down year for him in my opinion, but ultimately he still is that force for them on that defensive front. Obviously, another stellar linebacker to talk about. How about Fred Warner? Last year he had 52 solo tackles, 4 interceptions as a linebacker as well, just showing you the range he provides for them as well. And ultimately, you have 2 young defensive backs in Talanoa Hufanga and Charvarius Ward, who did not play full seasons last year. You get them back from injury, just adds a lot of depth to that back end. So overall, the San Francisco 49ers at number 2 is a high value defense, a highly coveted defense that should be gone very early in terms of defenses. But overall, they are well deserved to be at least in the top 3. So ultimately, look for them to go very highly in terms of defenses. At number 3 overall, we have another very versatile defense, mainly due to their defensive front. The Dallas Cowboys. Obviously, you have a player like Micah Parsons who can line up anywhere on the field. He's a linebacker, but he plays like a D-tackle, defensive end even. He just has incredible value with 14 sacks last year from the linebacker position. And looking at this Dallas Cowboys defense, it has much more balance than I think it has ever had. Obviously, you have a guy like Micah Parsons, you have DeMarcus Lawrence in your front, but on the back end as well, obviously Trayvon Diggs had a down year last year with only 1 pick, but Deron Bland setting the record for most interceptions in a season with 9 picks last year. Look for that DB group to step up, really have another big year, especially if full year of Trayvon Diggs is in store for this Dallas Cowboys defense. This is a scary defense, folks. I think that Dallas right now is a top 5 defense in my opinion. We'll have to see if, because of the question of Deshaun Watson offensively for the Browns and how that will affect their defense, if the Cowboys with Dak Prescott can vault into at least the top 2. But ultimately, I think they are right where they need to be, and I think they have a chance of being one of the highest defenses taken in fantasy drafts. But moving on to number 4, I think this team is kind of reflected in their ranking, the fact that they lost their defensive coordinator, but I still think they have the pieces to be one of the better defenses in the league, and that is the Baltimore Ravens. Obviously, you lose defensive coordinator Mike McDonald to the Seattle Seahawks, and new defensive coordinator Zach Orr will have to implement his scheme very quickly, but you still return a lot of players that made this defense great last year, starting off with Justin Madubuike on the defensive front. Madubuike is such an incredible player as a 3-4 player. 13 sacks last year, 38 solo tackles. Obviously, a very technical player, thrived in Mike McDonald's system. Let's see how he does in Zach Orr's system. And if you want a player at a linebacker position who is stellar, how about Roquan Smith? Been around many places, but but settling in with the Ravens last year with 84 solo tackles. So look for Roquan Smith to be another solid linebacker. And on the back end, you have another young DB that I think is a very exciting player that you drafted a couple years ago, Kyle Hamilton. 4 picks last year, 13 passes defended. Overall, this Ravens defense may have a new look to it depending on how Zach Orr implements his system, but ultimately you still have the players and personnel you need to be a top 5 defense in the league. So I'm not mad at that. Moving on to number 5. The New York Jets. This is another defense that might benefit from elevated quarterback play. Obviously, this defense was playing from behind a lot due to the fact that you had Zach Wilson and Tim Boyle and Trevor Siemian as your quarterbacks. So it didn't really reflect how well this defense did play last year. And it all starts with a big man up front, Big Q, Quinnen Williams. Last year, he did not have his best seasons, but he still is a preeminent defensive lineman for the Jets. 5.5 sacks last year, 39 solo tackles, proving that the big boy up front can be heavily effective. And another player who was kind of affected by last season, Sauce Gardner. He's still an elite cornerback, in my opinion, one of the elite young corners in the game. But last year he had no picks. Obviously, he's not necessarily known for picks, but he did have 12 passes defended last year. So that just shows how rangy and good he is for the Jets. And also, the Jets add another piece on the defensive front to combat Quinnen Williams and counteract his style of play. They add Hassan Reddick from Philly. He had 11 sacks for Philly last year, so he's going to be another huge presence that offensive lines will have to worry about when facing the Jets. Ultimately, I'm really excited for what the Jets defense can do when they play with a lead. They are big and bad. Coming in at number 6, another defense that can vaunt into the top 5 defenses right now, the Pittsburgh Steelers. And any defense with a guy like TJ Watt is going to be one of the best defenses in the league. 19 sacks last year. Just an incredible athlete. The AFC North fears a guy like TJ Watt. Just a stellar leader for them. Ultimately, the Steelers defense has a lot of depth. You have guys like Highsmith. You have guys like Hayward. But you all starts with TJ Watt. I think that he's such a game changer. That is why anytime you're looking for defenses, if you think about TJ Watt, you gotta pick the Steelers. They're kind of low in my opinion. I think they can be a top 3 defense come year's end. But ultimately, I think that they at least deserve to be in the top 10 because of that man, TJ Watt. Coming in at number 7, another underrated defense right here. I think that this defense may suffer from quarterback play, but the New Orleans Saints defense still has players that I think are some of the better, more underrated players in this league. And it all starts with Cameron Jordan. He's getting up there in age, but his production is not decreasing in my opinion. Last year, he only did have 2.5 sacks, but he is a huge part of that defensive front for them. And also they have a player like Honey Badger Tyrann Mathieu, who has 4 interceptions for them in that linebacker spot. They also signed Chase Young. Obviously, Chase Young bouncing around a lot of places. Where is he going to fit? I think he's going to be a perfect fit for the New Orleans Saints. Not a lot of pressure will be on him to deliver in that defensive front because of Cameron Jordan's presence. But ultimately, I think that Cameron Jordan and Chase Young is a nice little duo to have for the New Orleans Saints. And I think that they could rise as well. Obviously, they are not the most well-rounded team, so it's going to reflect on the defense a little bit more poorly, but ultimately they deserve to be on this list. Coming in at number 8, we have another underrated kind of blue-collar defense run by one of the better defensive minds in the league, Steve Spagnuolo. That is the Kansas City Chiefs, such a well-balanced defense. They have their stars, but I still think of their stars as kind of like these role players that Steve Spagnuolo made stars because of the way he runs his defense. And it all starts with big bad man Chris Jones. Obviously, retaining him was a big facet for them last year. 10.5 sacks. And on the other side, George Karlaftis, what an underrated player he's becoming. 10.5 sacks as well. A dynamic duo up front for the Kansas City Chiefs. In the middle of the park, you have a guy like Nick Bolton. Such an incredible athlete. Do-it-all linebacker. And on the back end, Trent McDuffie. What a player he is. Very physical, rangy corner. 5 forced fumbles as a corner, man. That is such a crazy stat to have for a corner. And overall, the Kansas City Chiefs, yes, people don't think of them as one of the better defenses in the league, but I do think that Steve Spagnuolo's aura makes them so much better. They play for him. They play the physical style of football led by Jones and Karlaftis up front and guys like McDuffie in the back end. So I think that the Chiefs well deserve to be on this list. Coming in at number 9, another underrated defense that is mainly in this top 10 in my opinion because of the players they are available to return for them. I think that this defense is going to be underrated come year's end, and that is the Miami Dolphins. When you add back in Bradley Chubb and Jalen Phillips, who had a breakout second season last year before unfortunately tearing his Achilles, I think that you have such incredible defensive depth up front as well. And you have a guy like Jalen Ramsey, who only had 3 picks last year due to his kind of limited game action. But ultimately, Chubb, Phillips, and Ramsey is one of the best cores in the league to build around. I think that the Dolphins are a very exciting up-and-coming defense, and it's reflected when both Chubb, Phillips, and Ramsey all play together. So yes, I feel that the Dolphins deserve to be in this top 10. And rounding out this top 10 is another kind of Kansas City Chiefs molded defense who has incredible blue-collar players as well, and that is the Cincinnati Bengals. I mean, this defense is heavily underrated in my opinion. I think this defense has a chance to be a top 7 defense at the very least coming into the season. And it all starts up front with Trey Hendrickson. 17.5 sacks. A player that does not get talked about enough. He does it all for them, man. I think that he's the heartbeat of this Cincinnati Bengals defense. Also, Geno Stone comes in from their arch rivals in the same division, the Baltimore Ravens. He had 7 picks last year, so let's not forget about him. Kind of that quarterback of the Baltimore Ravens defense last year coming into Cincinnati. And last but not least, Cincinnati born and bred man, Sam Hubbard, an incredible player, incredible athlete. 6 sacks last year, 38 solo tackles as well. And that will just about round out the ESPN defensive rankings. Coming up next, in my 4th segment of today's show, we are going to be talking about some breakout fantasy players that we may have highlighted on this channel and we may not have highlighted. So stick around for that. It should be a very exciting segment. We will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Hello and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. We are in the home stretch of this show, the second to last segment, and it should be a very exciting one. We are done with ESPN's PPR League rankings. We did the defense, and now we're going to look at some breakout fantasy players in the NFL. Now, these are some names that I may have highlighted when I did some previous rankings of ESPN's skill position players, and some of these players may not have been highlighted as often, but these are a couple of players that I think can be heavily effective come the start of the fantasy football season. I think that some of these players are coming off injury. Some of these players have not had good play from other skill positions that may benefit their output, but ultimately these are a group of players that you should look to grab come a fantasy draft time. We will start off in the AFC East with the New York Jets, and this player might shock some because he definitely doesn't seem like a breakout athlete, but when you add a quarterback who did not play as much last season, I think this guy will fall into even more superstardom levels, and that is Garrett Wilson. Consider this. Garrett Wilson has had back-to-back over 1,000-yard seasons, 178 catches to his name, and his quarterbacks were Zach Wilson, Tim Boyle, and Trevor Siemian. That is an incredible stat for any young rookie to have. Even coming into this league, obviously we knew that Garrett Wilson could be a star coming out of Ohio State, but ultimately he's never had that quarterback production to back up his style of play, and Aaron Rodgers coming in off that Achilles tear this year could vault him into superstardom now. It's quite an easy kind of assumption to think that Aaron Rodgers will elevate his game, but we can't push all our chickens into one basket because Aaron Rodgers is obviously older. He's 40 years old going into the season. Now, I just think that doesn't go against Garrett Wilson because of the fact that he's already had that level of production with much worse quarterback play. So that is why I think that Garrett Wilson will have an even huger season. Look for him to be one of the number one targets that Aaron Rodgers will go to come next year. Obviously, we'll have to see how Aaron Rodgers plays next year and if he wants to incorporate more of his guys who came in from the Packers into this offense. Obviously, Allen Lazard is still there, but ultimately, you can't overlook a guy like Garrett Wilson because of the insane statistics he put up in an offense that heavily underperformed due to their quarterback play. So he is one of my number one breakout fantasy athletes for next year. Coming in at the second spot that I want to talk about, another player who is kind of seen as an up-and-comer in this league in terms of fantasy. I think that he will be a great fantasy athlete for years to come for you guys. He should be a highly coveted asset later in the fantasy drafts as a quarterback, and that is Anthony Richardson of the Indianapolis Colts. Obviously, we were robbed of his rookie season, but in the games that he played, the Colts offense shined. They scored 26 points in the games that he played and only 13 in the 11 games that he did not. In 4 games, he scored over 20 plus fantasy points. So obviously, Anthony Richardson is looking to be one of the better fantasy quarterbacks next year in the NFL. This is his second year, obviously. He's going to be a little bit overlooked in that division. I think that CJ Stroud had the benefit of playing a full year, and he's highly going to be coveted next year in terms of fantasy. But Anthony Richardson is a guy to look out for in that division. I think he's the second best quarterback in that division. I'm going to say it. I think that Trevor Lawrence is regressing. Obviously, Will Levis has not had that much opportunity to play. He could be a solid quarterback, but I just haven't seen enough out of him. But Anthony Richardson, I think that in Shane Steichen's system in his second year, fully healthy, expect Anthony Richardson to be a huge fantasy points getter. I think anyone picking him up in the latter stages of fantasy drafts is a lucky guy because of the fact that Anthony Richardson, in the games that we have seen him play, has scored so many fantasy points, 20 plus in 4 games that he has played. And the Colts offense has skyrocketed because of him. So look for Anthony Richardson to be another breakout athlete in a full season, hopefully, for him. Coming in at number 3, a player who a lot of people expected to break out early on in his career, but also did not benefit from good quarterback play. This year, he finally gets that. It is Drake London. Drake London, in the Desmond Ridder, Arthur Smith era, obviously did not break out. He has been a player who has been much maligned because of the fact that a lot of people expected him to come into this league running, and he just hasn't. He's only had 62.1% of the targets in the years he's been in the NFL. But enter Kirk Cousins for him, and suddenly this Falcons offense becomes very hopeful, especially for a guy like Drake London, who is viewed as the number 1 wide receiver. Obviously, we'll have to see how Raheem Morris's offensive scheme works. We know he's a more defensive-minded coach, but overall, I feel that he's not going to be as limited as he was in Arthur Smith's system. I think that the addition of Kirk Cousins gives more opportunity for Drake London to shift his role, whether it be outside or the slot. I think that Drake London can get a lot more game action, a lot more targets, and that target usage rate will skyrocket for him. I think that overall this Falcons offense is going to be very exciting as well. A couple of players are going to be top 10 players in their respective positions. I don't think Drake London is quite there yet because obviously you still have guys like Kyle Pitts and Bijan Robinson who still want to be incorporated into this offense. But ultimately, I still think Drake London is going to have a huge year. I think he's going to have over 1,000 yards with Kirk Cousins. Obviously, Kirk Cousins has some great receivers, so he knows how to elevate their play. So Drake London is one of the players to look out for as a breakout fantasy athlete. I don't expect him to go very early in fantasy drafts, so if you're looking for someone later in rounds, he's going to be your guy. Now, last but not least, we talked about this team a little bit when I was talking about Will Levis and how he's going to look in terms of fantasy. We're going to transition to his running back, Tyjae Spears. Last year, he had 4.53 yards per carry for the Tennessee Titans last year. But ultimately, I'm looking at Tyjae Spears as a guy who needs to help Will Levis. Obviously, Will Levis does have a very exciting wide receiver core, very experienced wide receiver core. They brought in DeAndre Hopkins last year. They bring in Calvin Ridley from Jacksonville this year. I think that Tennessee is going to have a very interesting wide receiver core, but it all depends on Will Levis. If Will Levis performs to the levels he is expected to, he's had some great games last year, shown some toughness, some moxie, but ultimately it's all going to start with the run game. He's going to have to hand it off to Tyjae Spears in order to elevate the wide receivers around him, and ultimately that will translate into Tyjae Spears' stats. Right now, I kind of view him as an RB4. I don't think he's going to be that high a level. There are still guys above him who I expect to have much better production. But ultimately, Tyjae Spears is seen as one of those young guys who can help Will Levis progress in the Tennessee Titans system. Obviously, they bring in Brian Callahan as their head coach, an offensive-minded coach who's going to want to elevate Levis's play, and he's going to have to do that by implementing Tyjae Spears as well into the system. In his second year, Tyjae Spears, look for him to be a breakout fantasy athlete. That should just about do it for this segment. Coming up in the last segment of my show, we are going to have a special segment. Should the Mavs win tonight, we are going to take a look at the potential NBA Finals odds and what it means for a Celtics-Mavs series. So we will be right back with that segment. Hello and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. This is the final segment of today's show, and it should be a very exciting one. We are going to be looking at the potential NBA Finals betting odds, the potential NBA Finals storylines, should the Dallas Mavericks win tonight, as everyone expects. I think that this series is going to be very tough for a Boston Celtics team who could have lost at least 3 of the games they played in that 4-game series. They were very lucky to even win last night and win the game before. But ultimately, I think that this series is going to be a huge test for them should Dallas win tonight. We'll get to those storylines in a bit. But looking at the odds for the championship, I think that the Celtics right now are the highest odds. Last time I checked, they were at minus 225. And in terms of conference, they had an exorbitant sum on the money line for them. In terms of Dallas, they are at plus 185 for their money line to win the championship. And in terms of conference, they're at minus 2,500. I think that in terms of if this is going to be the finals matchup, I still think the Celtics will be the favorites, even though Luka and Kyrie have been the best duo of these playoffs. I just think that it's their time to break through. Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown are in their 19th and 21st series, respectively, before winning an NBA Finals. Very similar to someone named LeBron James, if you've ever heard of him, before he won an NBA Finals. So I just think that this is their time to break through. I don't think that they're the same team as they were. We saw in the series that when tested, when they were down and they looked like they were out, they came back in both game 3 and 4 in good fashion, even in game 1 when they went to overtime. So I think that the Celtics are better equipped now than they ever were, especially if Kristaps Porzingis returns to combat what Dallas has to offer should they clinch tonight. Let's get into some of the storylines, starting off with KP's return. I think that the Celtics made a very interesting decision to hold him out of Game 4. Obviously, if you're the Boston Celtics, you may have wanted to see how KP looked in game action. Obviously, just putting him straight into the finals could affect his style of play. Obviously, they're going to need a big man to combat the very energetic Derek Lively II and Daniel Gafford down low. But ultimately, I think it's a good decision. They want KP to get his rest. I think it's well-deserved. He needs to be healthy in order for him to be productive in this finals. However, I do think it may kind of muddy the waters of who the betting favorite for finals MVP could be. Ultimately, right now, Jason Tatum leads the odds and even odds. Luka Doncic is at plus 280, and Jaylen Brown right now is at plus 425 after winning the Eastern Conference Finals MVP Larry Bird Trophy. Congratulations to him. He had a stellar series. But looking at how this would be affected if KP returns, I think that KP is obviously going to limit how Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum play. They're very 1-2 my turn, your turn kind of players. I think KP's addition to this offense helps that kind of stagnated mindset where Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown feel as if they need to score the points for the Celtics. He adds a lot more in the pick and roll, in the post up. I just think that Kristaps Porzingis, if he's fully fit and plays as if he's fully fit, could kind of limit how people go forward in terms of who they view as the betting favorite. That might elevate a player such as Luka Doncic. Right now, Luka Doncic is second in terms of the betting odds for NBA Finals MVP. Deservedly so. He's part of that duo with Kyrie Irving that has been so incredible in this series against Minnesota. Obviously, he's averaged over 35 points per game in this series. So, Luka Doncic right now could find himself, if the Dallas Mavericks win this series and maybe even get an early lead in the NBA Finals should they get there. I think that Luka Doncic gets vaulted up due to the fact that Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown will now have to include Kristaps Porzingis into their offensive thoughts and mindset. So look for Luka Doncic's name to rise potentially to that number 1 spot right now. Jason Tatum obviously may have been affected by not winning the Eastern Conference Finals MVP as well. Still had a very good series, had some very good stat lines obviously in Game 3. Very impressive stat line where he was the first player to have a stat line of that kind without any turnovers. But ultimately, the Dallas Mavericks are a different animal in my opinion, and I just think that Luka Doncic could find himself sitting pretty at the top of the of the NBA Finals, MVP rankings. Now, looking ahead as to how KP will have to play against Lively and Gafford, I think that the Dallas Mavericks have the benefit of rotation between these two exciting young players in their defensive front. I think that Lively and Gafford are two spark plugs. They don't score points, but they're definitely going to be tasked with limiting the production of Kristaps Porzingis. Obviously, I think that if this were to be the finals matchup, the Dallas Mavericks would have the advantage in the front court because of the fact that Kristaps Porzingis is more or less the number one standard for the Celtics front court. Obviously, Al Horford can't add that 3-point production on the offensive side, but defensively, he has proven to be a liability whenever Miles Turner or Pascal Siakam would switch onto him in that Eastern Conference Finals series. So ultimately, I think that Lively and Gafford will be able to get their opportunities to add their role-playing depth and tenacity down low in the paint to combat Kristaps Porzingis and not fully fit Kristaps Porzingis as well. Also, I think Joe Mazzulla will have to be tasked with figuring out how to combat them as well. Obviously, we haven't seen in the Pacers series anyone outside of Al Horford be able to produce except for O'Shea Brissett, but he was more in terms of filling out some minutes. So Joe Mazzulla is going to have to be tactically sound in how he sets up his front court and who gets a number of minutes. Obviously, there seems to be a trust issue between Joe Mazzulla and some of his bench players. He's more confident playing some backcourt role players and not some frontcourt role players. Obviously, Luke Cornett's injury was also a very big thing that kind of influenced that decision-making, where Joe Mazzulla felt that he had to force his hand and had to put Al Horford out there for an exorbitant amount of minutes. Al Horford's aging, he can't play that many minutes, so who will be the Celtics role player in terms of frontcourt play that will step up and be the number one guy behind Kristaps Porzingis and Al Horford when needed? I think that in terms of fantasy, I think that you will have to look at Celtics frontcourt players now because of the fact that Joe Mazzulla has no choice but to play more than two frontcourt players to combat Lively and Gafford, because honestly, they have the advantage in the frontcourt and maybe even the backcourt because they match up so well for their style of play to kind of combat Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. So looking at these two duos then, Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown against Luka Doncic and Kyrie, what we've seen out of Luka and Kyrie is the fact that they can play off each other so well. Kyrie's kind of the driving presence. He wants to get into the paint, get to the rim. Luka is then able to get his mid-range going and the three-point production going. As we can see, it's kind of a tale of two halves where Kyrie kind of takes over one half and Luka kind of elevates his play in a latter half, whereas Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown, they don't really have those moments where one of them steps to the plate. And that has been a huge problem for Boston. Which one of them is going to be that personality that says, hey, I'm dominating the ball? It looks like Jaylen Brown might be the guy going forward because of the fact that as Eastern Conference Finals MVP, he did have that big game in Game 2 where he had 40 points. But ultimately, going forward, it's going to be very interesting to see how the Celtics star style of play and the Mavericks star style of play is affected by which coach is able to adapt to the adjustments the other coach makes. I think that right now, Jason Kidd should feel happy that his duo is going, but he knows that offensive production is enough. And Joe Mazzulla, on the other hand, is going to have to worry about his defensive structure. Can Kristaps Porzingis hold up against two very spark-pluggy kind of players in terms of Lively and Gafford, and who he will have to play to kind of add to the minutes and production off the bench for his front court so that Kristaps Porzingis doesn't get tired, nor does Al Horford as well. But that should just about do it for this segment. I love talking about the potential NBA Finals implications should the Mavericks win tonight. Should be a very exciting game for tonight in the Western Conference. But that is going to do it from the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Like, follow, and subscribe to the show. Please also consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. It'll be very appreciated for the network, me, and my fellow podcasters. But that's just about do it. My name's been Christopher Sheppard. Join us tomorrow. We should have another exciting show ahead. Thank you guys for tuning in.
Let's go.
I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great. I don't wanna go to